Have you ever heard about the man who said the NSA trained him to talk to aliens? Not to observe them, not to chase UFOs across radar screens, but to speak with them in a language that wasn't spoken at all. His name was Sergeant Dan Sherman, and according to him, he didn't just monitor signals from somewhere else in the sky. He was the signal. And for a few strange years inside a classified project called Preserve Destiny, he claimed to be the bridge between human intelligence and something beyond it. Tonight, we're going to walk quietly through that story, not to prove it, not to debunk it, but to trace the faint lines of one man's testimony through the silence that followed, the kind of story that lingers long after the lights go out. Chapter 1. The Briefing Room. The 1990s carried a particular weight in the world of military intelligence. The Cold War had technically ended, but its infrastructure remained. Vast networks of surveillance, encryption, and secrecy that didn't simply dissolve because walls came down or treaties were signed. The machinery was still there, humming beneath the surface, and people like Dan Sherman were part of it. Sherman was an electronic intelligence specialist in the United States Air Force. His work involved signals intelligence, the kind of technical operations where you sit in front of screens and interpret data streams that most people would never see or understand. It was precise, methodical work. The kind that required clearance, discretion, and a certain temperament. Someone who could sit in silence for hours, watching patterns emerge from static. By most accounts, Sherman was good at what he did. He'd been trained at Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas, one of the primary sites for intelligence training in the US military. He understood communications intercept, electronic warfare support, and the bureaucratic architecture that governed classified operations. He knew how to follow orders, how to handle sensitive information, and how to keep his head down. But in the early 1990s, something changed. According to Sherman, he was approached about a special assignment, not through the usual channels, but quietly, almost peripherally. The details were vague at first. He was told only that he'd been selected for a program that required his particular skill set, and that the nature of the work would be explained once he agreed to participate. It wasn't unusual for military personnel to be tapped for classified projects. What was unusual was the tone of the invitation. There was no sense of urgency, no appeal to patriotism or duty. Just a calm, almost clinical question. Would he be interested in contributing to a program that involved communication research? Sherman agreed. The briefing room where he first learned the details of the project wasn't remarkable. It was located within a secure facility, one of those anonymous buildings that dot military installations across the country. Fluorescent lights, plain walls, a table, a few chairs. The kind of space designed to strip away distraction and keep focus narrow. 2 men were present when Sherman arrived. He described them later as unremarkable in appearance. Mid-level officers or intelligence officials, dressed in civilian clothes, professional but not particularly warm. They introduced themselves without providing much context, and then they explained what Sherman had been brought there to do. The project was called Preserve Destiny. Its purpose, they told him, was to establish and maintain communication with non-human intelligences. Not through radio signals or encrypted transmissions, but through something they called intuitive communication, a direct cognitive interface that bypassed language entirely. Sherman didn't react immediately. He sat there trying to process what he'd just heard. Aliens. They were talking about aliens, and they were telling him, calmly and matter-of-factly, that his role in this project would be to communicate with them. He asked the obvious questions. How? Why him? What did they mean by intuitive communication? The answers came slowly, delivered in the same measured tone that characterized everything about the briefing. Sherman had been selected, they explained, because of a specific biological characteristic, a predisposition that made him capable of interfacing with non-human consciousnesses in ways that most people could not. And that predisposition, they told him, was not an accident. It was something that had been engineered before he was born. Sherman sat in that room, under those fluorescent lights, and tried to make sense of what he was hearing. He wasn't prone to conspiracy thinking. He wasn't someone who spent his free time reading about UFOs or government cover-ups. He was a technician, a signals analyst, someone who dealt in verifiable data. But here he was, being told that he was part of something that sounded like science fiction, and the people telling him weren't fringe theorists or anonymous sources. They were officials within the structure he'd been trained to trust. So he asked another question. What exactly did they want him to do? The answer was simple. Sit at a terminal, focus, and listen. Not with his ears, not in any conventional sense, but with something deeper, something that supposedly existed within his neurology, an ability to perceive and interpret signals that arrived not through sound or light, but through some other channel entirely. Sherman was skeptical, but he was also curious, and he was a soldier. He'd been given an assignment. So he said yes. What followed was a period of orientation, though it didn't resemble any training he'd received before. There were no manuals, no technical schematics, just sessions where he was taught to quiet his mind, to focus inward, and to recognize patterns of thought that felt foreign, impressions that seemed to arrive from somewhere outside himself. He was told that these impressions were the foundation of intuitive communication, that with practice he would learn to distinguish between his own thoughts and the signals being transmitted to him, and that eventually he would be able to establish a clear, functional dialogue with whatever entities existed on the other end. It sounded absurd, but the project was real, the facility was real, the equipment was real, and the people running it were serious. Sherman began his first sessions with a mixture of doubt and anticipation. He didn't know what to expect. He wasn't even sure he believed the premise. But he sat down at the terminal, closed his eyes, and tried to listen. And after a while, something answered. Chapter 2. The Implant and the Revelation. Before Sherman could begin his work in earnest, there was another briefing. This one was quieter, more personal, and far stranger than anything that had come before. He was taken into a smaller room, just him and one of the project supervisors. The man's demeanour was different this time, less clinical, more cautious, as though he were about to deliver information that required careful handling. Sherman was told that his ability to participate in Project Preserve Destiny wasn't simply a matter of aptitude or training. It was biological, neurological, something that had been built into him before he was even aware of himself. The supervisor explained that during his mother's pregnancy, she had been part of a program. Sherman hadn't known this. His mother had never mentioned it, and there was no reason she would have. According to the supervisor, the program was classified at a level that ensured participants wouldn't even know what they were part of. But the goal, Sherman was told, was clear: to create a generation of individuals capable of interfacing with non-human intelligence. This was done, allegedly, through a process involving genetic or neurological modification during prenatal development. The specifics weren't explained, or perhaps they couldn't be explained, but the implication was that Sherman's brain had been subtly altered in utero to enable the kind of communication that Project Preserve Destiny required. Sherman sat there, absorbing this. He thought about his childhood, his family, his mother. He tried to reconcile the image of her with the idea that she'd been unknowingly involved in some covert government experiment. It didn't fit. Nothing about it fit. He asked whether his mother knew. The supervisor said it was unlikely. Participants in the prenatal program were typically told they were part of a health study or a research initiative related to fetal development. They weren't informed about the true purpose. The goal was to create a pool of candidates who could be identified and recruited later, once they reached adulthood. Sherman was one of those candidates. He had been, in a sense, designed for this. The revelation was disorienting. It reframed his entire sense of self. He wasn't just a soldier who'd been selected for a project. He was a product of that project, created decades earlier with a specific purpose in mind. And now, in his 20s, that purpose was being activated. He asked why he was being told this now. The supervisor's answer was pragmatic. Sherman needed to understand the nature of his abilities in order to use them effectively. If he believed he was simply learning a new skill, he might struggle to access the deeper mechanisms that made intuitive communication possible. But if he understood that those mechanisms were already present, hardwired into his neurology, he could engage with them more directly. It was a kind of psychological preparation, or maybe it was just honesty. Either way, Sherman left that briefing with a profound sense of unease. He went home that night and tried to process what he'd learned. He didn't tell his wife the details. He couldn't. The classification was too strict. But he felt the weight of it pressing down on him. The idea that his life had been shaped by forces he'd never seen, that his very consciousness had been engineered for a purpose he was only now beginning to understand. It was too much. And yet, it explained things. He'd always had a sense that he perceived the world slightly differently than other people, not in any dramatic way, but in subtle, hard-to-define moments, flashes of intuition that seemed too precise to be coincidence, a feeling that he was picking up on information that wasn't being communicated through normal channels. He dismissed it as pattern recognition or heightened awareness, the kind of thing that comes with intelligence work. But now, with this new context, those moments took on a different meaning. Maybe they hadn't been quirks of perception, maybe they'd been glimpses of something deeper, a latent capability waiting to be activated. Sherman returned to the project the next day and resumed his sessions, but now everything felt different. He wasn't just a participant, he was the instrument, and whatever communication was about to unfold, it would be happening through him, not around him. The terminal he worked at was unremarkable from the outside. A computer interface, a keyboard, a monitor displaying simple text fields. But the process of using it was unlike anything he'd encountered before. He was instructed to sit quietly, clear his mind, and focus on a state of receptive awareness. Not active listening, but something more passive. A kind of mental stillness that allowed signals to emerge without being forced. At first there was nothing. Just the hum of the machinery, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, and his own thoughts circling endlessly. But gradually, over the course of several sessions, he began to notice something, impressions. Faint, almost subliminal patterns that seemed to drift into his awareness without any clear origin. They weren't thoughts exactly, but they weren't entirely foreign either. They felt like echoes of thoughts, fragments of intention that had been transmitted from somewhere else and were now resonating within his mind. Sherman was told to log these impressions, to write them down as clearly as possible, even if they seemed nonsensical or incomplete. The goal wasn't to interpret them yet, but simply to establish that a connection was being made. And slowly, session by session, the connection grew stronger. The impressions became more distinct. They started to carry a sense of structure, as though they were being organized by some external intelligence. And then, eventually, they began to feel less like random noise and more like intentional communication. Someone, or something, was trying to speak with him, and it was working. Chapter 3. The Interface. The room where Sherman conducted his work was sterile, in the way that classified facilities often are. Clean, minimal, designed to eliminate distraction. There were no windows, no decoration, just the terminal, a chair, and the constant low hum of ventilation systems pushing filtered air through narrow ducts. He would sit at the interface for hours at a time waiting for the impressions to arrive. Sometimes they came quickly, flooding his awareness with fragmented imagery and emotional tones. Other times, there was nothing but silence, and he would sit in that silence, wondering if the connection had been severed or if he was simply failing to perceive what was being sent. The terminal itself was simple, a text interface where he would type out the impressions as they occurred to him. There was no guidance on what to write or how to structure it. Just a directive. Record everything, even if it seemed meaningless, even if it didn't make sense in the moment. Sherman quickly learned that the impressions didn't arrive in any conventional linguistic form. There were no words, no grammar, no syntax. Instead, the communication came as a kind of conceptual shorthand. Ideas, emotions, and visual fragments that he had to translate into language after the fact. It was exhausting, not physically, but mentally. The act of holding his mind in that receptive state, of staying open to signals that felt both internal and external, required a level of focus that left him drained at the end of each session. But it was also fascinating, because the more he practiced, the clearer the impressions became. He started to recognize patterns, recurring themes, and what felt like distinct sources. It wasn't just random noise, there was intention behind it, structure, and that structure suggested the presence of an intelligence that was actively trying to communicate. The project supervisors monitored his progress closely. They reviewed his session logs, asked questions about the nature of the impressions, and occasionally provided feedback. But they never explained what they were doing with the information he was gathering. He was told only that his role was to maintain the connection and record what he received. Sherman began to feel like a conduit, not an active participant in the communication, but a passive channel through which information was flowing. He didn't initiate contact. He didn't ask questions. He simply opened himself to whatever signals were being transmitted and did his best to capture them before they faded. The experience was strange in ways that were hard to articulate. When the impressions arrived, they didn't feel entirely foreign. There was a familiarity to them, as though he were accessing a part of his own mind that had always been there but had never been used. And yet the content of those impressions clearly didn't originate from his own thoughts. He would receive images of places he'd never been, concepts he'd never considered, and emotional textures that felt distinctly non-human. They were subtle, but they were real. And over time, he learned to distinguish between his own mental activity and the signals that were being transmitted to him. The training had emphasized this distinction. Sherman was told repeatedly that the most important skill in intuitive communication was the ability to recognize what was yours and what wasn't, to quiet your own internal dialogue enough that the external signal could emerge clearly. It was a discipline, and like any discipline, it required practice. But as the weeks passed, Sherman began to wonder what exactly he was connecting to. The project supervisors had told him he was communicating with non-human intelligences, but they hadn't provided any details about who or what those intelligences were. Were they extraterrestrial, interdimensional, something else entirely? He didn't know, and when he asked, the answers were vague. He was told that the entities varied, that multiple sources were involved, and that his role was simply to maintain the connection, not to analyze the nature of the entities on the other end. But Sherman was curious. He couldn't help but wonder about the consciousness he was interfacing with. What did they want? Why were they communicating with him? And what was the purpose of Project Preserve Destiny beyond simply establishing contact? Those questions lingered in the back of his mind during every session, but they remained unanswered. All he had were the impressions, arriving in waves, each one a fragment of something larger that he couldn't quite see. And then, one day, the impressions became more focused, less abstract, more direct. Sherman felt a shift in the quality of the communication. The signals were still arriving in the same non-linguistic form, but they carried a stronger sense of presence. As though the entity on the other end had moved closer, become more attentive, more deliberate in its attempts to communicate. He logged the session as usual, typing out the impressions as quickly as they came. But this time, something was different. The impressions weren't just fragments anymore. They were forming into something that resembled a coherent exchange. Sherman realized, with a strange mixture of excitement and dread, that he was no longer just receiving signals. He was beginning to have a conversation. Chapter 4. First Contact, Spock. The first entity Sherman communicated with wasn't introduced through any formal means. There was no greeting, no preamble, just a gradual intensification of the impressions he'd been receiving, until one day they coalesced into something that felt like a distinct presence. Sherman didn't have a name for it. The communication wasn't linguistic, so there was no identifier attached to the signals, but he needed a way to distinguish this presence from others that might follow, so he gave it a nickname. He called it Spock. The name was a half-joke, a reference to Star Trek and the character who embodied logic and detachment. It felt appropriate because the impression Sherman received from this entity had a cold, analytical quality. There was no warmth, no emotion, just a steady stream of data that arrived with mechanical precision. The early exchanges were fragmentary. Spock, if that's what it was, seemed to be testing the connection, sending simple concepts and waiting to see if Sherman could interpret them. Shapes, colours, numbers. Basic geometric patterns that Sherman could easily translate into language. But as the sessions continued, the communication grew more complex. Spock began transmitting information that was harder to decode. Abstract ideas that didn't correspond to anything in Sherman's frame of reference. Concepts that felt foreign, almost incomprehensible, but still carried a sense of intentionality. Sherman logged everything, even when he wasn't sure what he was recording. He would sit at the terminal typing out impressions that felt like static, like noise, like fragments of something larger that he couldn't quite grasp. And then, every so often, a clear signal would emerge from the chaos. One session in particular stood out. Sherman had been sitting at the interface for nearly an hour, receiving nothing but vague, formless impressions. He was beginning to wonder if the connection had degraded, if Spock had stopped transmitting, or if he was simply too tired to perceive the signals clearly. And then, suddenly the impressions shifted. They became sharp, focused, almost urgent. Sherman felt a surge of information flooding into his awareness. It wasn't visual, but it carried the texture of images, dark shapes moving through darker spaces, a sense of vastness, of distance, of something ancient and vast observing from far away. He tried to hold on to the impressions, to translate them into words before they faded, but they were slipping away even as he typed, dissolving back into the formless static from which they had emerged. When the session ended, Sherman sat back and read what he'd written. It was disjointed, cryptic, but there was something in it that felt significant, a reference to observation, to watching, to a presence that had been here, on Earth, for longer than humanity had existed. Sherman reported the session to his supervisors. They reviewed the log, asked a few questions, and then filed it away without comment. He wasn't sure what they made of it, or whether it aligned with information they were receiving from other sources, but for Sherman it marked a turning point. The communication was no longer just an abstract exercise. It was starting to convey meaning, and that meaning, however fragmented, suggested that the entity on the other end had knowledge, perspective, and intention. Spock continued to transmit over the following weeks. The signals remained cool and analytical, rarely carrying any emotional content, but they grew more detailed, more structured, as though the entity was learning to communicate more effectively through Sherman's interface. Sherman began to recognize recurring themes in the transmissions, references to monitoring, to observation, to the collection of data. It was as though Spock was describing its own activities, its own role in whatever larger operation was unfolding. But the entity never explained why it was communicating with Sherman. It never provided context for the information it transmitted. It simply sent the signals, and Sherman recorded them. He asked during one session if Spock could clarify its purpose, but the question seemed to go unanswered, or perhaps it was answered in a way that Sherman couldn't interpret. The impressions that followed were vague, circular, suggesting something about function, about design, about roles assigned long ago. Sherman came to understand that the communication was limited not just by his ability to receive the signals, but by the nature of the entities transmitting them. They didn't think the way humans did. They didn't communicate in narratives or explanations. They transmitted data, and it was up to Sherman to make sense of it. It was frustrating, but it was also humbling. He was interfacing with something genuinely non-human, and that meant letting go of expectations about how communication should work. He couldn't demand clarity. He could only remain open to whatever signals arrived. And then, one day, the signal stopped. Spock, or whatever it was, simply ceased transmitting. Sherman sat at the terminal waiting, but the impressions didn't come. He tried to re-establish the connection, to quiet his mind and open himself to the familiar presence, but there was nothing. The project supervisors told him not to be concerned. They explained that contact with these entities was never guaranteed to be continuous. The communication could stop and start for reasons that weren't always clear. Sherman's role was simply to maintain his readiness, to be available whenever the signals resumed. So he waited. Days passed, then weeks, and just when Sherman was beginning to think that the connection had been permanently severed, the impressions returned. But this time, they were different. This time, they came from someone else. Chapter 5. Bones arrives. The second entity Sherman communicated with had a different quality entirely. Where Spock had been cold and analytical, this new presence felt warmer, more engaged, more willing to meet Sherman halfway in the communication process. He called it Bones, another Star Trek reference, chosen partly because it felt appropriate and partly because Sherman needed some way to humanize the experience. Without names, the entities remained abstract, and the abstraction made the whole thing feel even more surreal than it already was. Bones introduced itself, or rather made its presence known, through impressions that carried emotional weight. Not human emotions exactly, but something analogous. A sense of curiosity, of interest, of intentionality that went beyond the mechanical data transmission Sherman had experienced with Spock. The early sessions with Bones were exploratory. The entity seemed to be assessing Sherman, testing the bandwidth of the connection, determining how much information could be transmitted and how clearly it would be received. Sherman found the communication easier with Bones than it had been with Spock. The impressions arrived more fluidly, with less static, less interference. It was as though Bones had a better understanding of how to interface with human consciousness, or perhaps simply a greater interest in doing so effectively. The content of the transmissions was different as well. Bones didn't send data in the detached, observational way that Spock had. Instead, it transmitted concepts that felt like stories, like fragments of history, like explanations. Sherman began to receive impressions about ancient visitations, about beings coming to Earth long before recorded history, about genetic influence, about the seeding of traits and capabilities into the human population. It was impossible to verify, of course. The communication didn't come with citations or evidence. It was just information, arriving in waves, and Sherman's job was to record it. But the consistency of the narrative was striking. Bones seemed to be describing a long, complex relationship between non-human intelligences and humanity. A relationship that stretched back thousands of years and involved deliberate intervention in human development. Sherman asked, or tried to ask, in the indirect way that intuitive communication required, why this information was being shared. What was the purpose of these transmissions? What did Bones want him to understand? The impressions that followed were difficult to pass, but they carried a sense of inevitability, as though the information was being provided not because it would change anything, but because Sherman needed to know. Because his role in Project Preserve Destiny required him to understand the context within which he was operating. Bones also transmitted information about itself, though the details were fragmentary. Sherman received impressions of otherness, of existing in a state that didn't correspond to physical embodiment in any conventional sense. There were no images of a body, no descriptions of a homeworld or origin point, just a sense of presence that existed outside the normal constraints of time and space. It was during one of these sessions that Sherman began to feel a deeper connection with Bones. Not emotional, exactly, but relational, as though the entity was becoming familiar with him, and he with it. The communication felt less like intercepting a signal, and more like engaging in an exchange. Sherman logged his impressions carefully, noting the shift in quality, the increased clarity, the sense that Bones was actively working to make itself understood. And the information kept coming. Impressions of ancient structures, of knowledge passed down through generations, of humanity being guided subtly and over long periods of time toward a state of readiness for something that hadn't yet occurred. Sherman didn't know what to make of it. The narrative was too large, too strange, and too far removed from anything he could verify. But it had a coherence that was hard to dismiss. Bones wasn't rambling, it was explaining, and the explanation, however alien, seemed to follow an internal logic. One session stood out in particular. Sherman received a series of impressions that felt more direct than anything that had come before. Bones transmitted a concept that Sherman struggled to translate, but the core of it was clear. Humanity had been prepared for contact over millennia. Not all at once, but gradually, through genetic modification, cultural influence, and the slow introduction of ideas that would make the eventual revelation less shocking. The impression suggested that Project Preserve Destiny was part of this preparation, that Sherman himself was part of it, that the entire operation was a step in a much longer process that had been unfolding for longer than anyone involved could fully comprehend. Sherman sat with that information for a long time after the session ended. He didn't know if he believed it. He didn't know if belief was even the right framework for processing what he was experiencing, but the communication continued. And with each session, Bones transmitted more information, more context, more fragments of a story that stretched across time and space. And then, just as Sherman was beginning to feel that he understood the nature of the communication, the content changed again. The impressions from Bones became more focused on logistics, coordinates, times, locations, data that felt less like narrative and more like mission parameters. Sherman logged it all, but he didn't understand what he was recording. The information was precise, technical, and devoid of the explanatory context that Bones had been providing earlier. When he asked what the data was for, the impressions that returned were vague. Something about monitoring, about tracking, about events that needed to be documented. Sherman reported the shift to his supervisors. They reviewed the logs and told him to continue. They didn't seem surprised by the change. They didn't offer any explanation. And Sherman, sitting alone at the interface, began to realize that he might not be part of a research project after all. He might be part of something operational. Chapter 6. The message changes. The shift in the nature of the transmissions was gradual at first, but it became impossible to ignore. What had begun as conceptual communication, impressions of history, purpose, and connection, transformed into something far more mechanical. Bones continued to transmit. but the signals no longer carried the warmth or narrative quality that had characterized the earlier sessions. Instead, Sherman began receiving data that felt cold, precise, and logistical. Coordinates, dates, times. He would sit at the interface and the impressions would arrive as strings of information that he had to decode and translate into conventional formats. Latitude and longitude. Timestamps down to the minute. Locations that seemed to correspond to points on Earth, though Sherman had no way to verify what those locations were or why they mattered. The work became tedious. Where the earlier communication had felt like discovery, this felt like data entry. Sherman would log the information, file the reports, and move on to the next session. The sense of wonder that had accompanied his first contacts with Spock and Bones faded, replaced by a routine that felt increasingly disconnected from any larger purpose. But the information kept coming, and as the weeks passed, patterns began to emerge. Many of the coordinates corresponded to remote locations, rural areas, forests, isolated stretches of desert. The timestamps clustered around specific times of day, late night, early morning, periods when human activity was minimal. Sherman didn't know what the data represented. He asked his supervisors, but their answers were evasive. He was told that the information was being cross-referenced with other intelligence sources, that it was part of a larger analytical framework, and that his role was simply to maintain the communication and record what he received. But Sherman began to suspect something. The precision of the data, the focus on specific times and locations, the way the transmissions had shifted from narrative to logistics. It all suggested that he was logging something specific, something real. And then, during one session, Bones transmitted something that made Sherman's suspicions concrete. He received an impression of a human being, not a clear image, but a conceptual reference, a person, at a specific location, at a specific time. And accompanying that impression was a sense of retrieval, of collection. Sherman tried to push deeper into the impression, to understand what was being communicated. But the signal was faint, already fading. All he was left with was the core concept. Someone had been taken. He logged the session and sat back, staring at the screen. The data he'd been recording, the coordinates, the timestamps, the locations, suddenly took on a darker significance. He wasn't just facilitating communication, he was logging abductions. The realization was jarring. Sherman had gone into Project Preserve Destiny believing he was part of a research initiative, a program designed to establish contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. He'd thought his role was benign, even noble. But now, sitting alone in that sterile room, he began to understand that the project had a different purpose. He was documenting encounters, real, physical events where human beings were being taken from their homes, their cars, their lives, and subjected to something he couldn't fully comprehend. And the entities he was communicating with, Spock, Bones, whoever or whatever they were providing the data. They were telling him where it was happening, when it was happening, and implicitly who was involved. Sherman felt sick. He'd signed on to be a conduit, a translator, but he hadn't expected to become complicit in something like this. He didn't know what happened to the people whose coordinates he was logging. He didn't know if they were returned, if they remembered what had happened, or if they were harmed. He asked his supervisors about it. He didn't accuse them of anything, but he voiced his concerns as clearly as he could, within the bounds of the project's classification. Their response was clinical. They told him that the data he was collecting was valuable for national security purposes, that the information was helping the government understand patterns of non-human activity, that his work was contributing to a larger effort to monitor and assess potential threats. They didn't deny that the data corresponded to abduction events. They simply reframed it, and they made it clear that Sherman's role was to continue the communication, not to question what was being done with the information he provided. Sherman returned to the interface, but something had changed. He no longer felt like a participant in first contact. He felt like a clerk, logging transactions in a system he didn't control and couldn't escape. The sessions continued. Bones transmitted more data, more coordinates, more times. Sherman logged them all, mechanically, with a growing sense of dread. He began to wonder who else was involved. How many other people like him were sitting in rooms like this, interfacing with entities like Spock and Bones, recording information that would be used in ways they'd never fully understand. And he wondered too about the entities themselves. Were they aware of what their information was being used for? Did they care? Or were they simply fulfilling a function, transmitting data as part of some agreement or protocol that predated Sherman's involvement by decades? The questions haunted him, but the answers never came. All he had was the interface, the steady stream of impressions, and the growing weight of knowledge he wished he didn't have. The communication became harder to bear. Every session felt like complicity. Every log entry felt like betrayal. Sherman wasn't just a translator anymore, he was a witness, and he had no way to stop what he was documenting. Chapter 7. The Weight of Secrets. Sherman's daily life began to fracture under the weight of what he knew. He couldn't talk about the project. Not to his wife, not to his friends, not to anyone outside the classified structure of preserved destiny. The secrecy was absolute, enforced by clearance protocols and the implicit threat that came with working on programs that officially didn't exist. But silence has a cost, and Sherman began to pay it. He found himself withdrawing. Conversations at home felt hollow because he couldn't share the thing that dominated his thoughts. His wife noticed the change but didn't know what to attribute it to. Military work was often stressful, often required long hours and emotional distance, so she tried to be patient. But Sherman wasn't just stressed, he was isolated, locked inside his own awareness of something vast and troubling that he couldn't articulate or escape. The sessions at the interface continued. Day after day he would sit in that sterile room, receive transmissions from bones or other entities that began to appear intermittently, and log the data. The work was relentless, repetitive, and emotionally exhausting. The entities didn't ask how he was doing. They didn't acknowledge his discomfort. They simply transmitted information, and Sherman recorded it. His supervisors remained distant. Their interactions with him were brief, professional, and offered no insight into how the data he was collecting was being used. He tried a few times to ask broader questions about the purpose of the project, about the nature of the entities, about what would happen when the communication ended. But the answers were always vague. He was told that the project was ongoing, that his work was important, and that he should focus on maintaining the quality of the transmissions rather than worrying about the larger framework. It was clear that Sherman wasn't meant to understand the full picture. He was a tool, a specialized component in a system that extended far beyond his awareness, and that realization was crushing. Sherman began to suspect that he was being monitored more closely than he'd initially thought. There were small signs, a sense that his movements within the facility were being tracked, that his behavior was being assessed, that even his private thoughts might not be entirely private. He couldn't prove it, but the feeling persisted, a paranoia that was hard to dismiss because the entire structure of the project was built on surveillance, secrecy, and control. He started to wonder if the intuitive communication interface worked both ways. If Bones could transmit information to him, could it also receive information from him? Could it sense his doubts, his discomfort, his growing desire to walk away? The question bothered him more than he wanted to admit, because if the communication was truly bidirectional, then he wasn't just a passive receiver, he was exposed, transparent, and everything he thought or felt during those sessions might be known to entities whose intentions he didn't fully understand. Sherman tried to maintain a professional detachment. He treated the work as a job, no different from any other intelligence operation. But the lines kept blurring. The communication felt personal in ways that conventional intelligence work never had. And the data he was logging carried a human cost that he couldn't ignore. One night he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the people whose coordinates he'd recorded. He imagined them in their homes, going about their lives, unaware that they'd been flagged, documented, monitored. He didn't know what would happen to them. He didn't know if the government would intervene, if the entities would return, or if the data was simply being archived for future reference. But he knew that his role in the process made him complicit, and that complicity weighed on him more than any security clearance or oath of secrecy. The isolation deepened. Sherman felt disconnected not just from the people around him, but from himself. The work at the interface was changing him, shaping his thoughts in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He was spending hours each day in a state of receptive awareness, opening his mind to signals from non-human consciousnesses, and that openness was bleeding into the rest of his life. He began to notice things he hadn't noticed before, patterns in conversation, synchronicities in daily events, moments where it felt like information was arriving in his awareness without any clear source. He didn't know if these were side effects of the intuitive communication training, or if he was simply paying more attention to things he'd previously ignored. But the boundary between his work and his identity was eroding. He wasn't just Dan Sherman, the signals analyst. He was becoming something else, a conduit, an interface, a person whose consciousness had been reshaped by prolonged contact with something fundamentally alien, and he didn't know how to stop it. The supervisors never asked about his mental state. There were no psychological evaluations, no check-ins to ensure he was handling the work well. It was as though they assumed he would endure, or perhaps they didn't care whether he did or not. Sherman endured because he didn't know what else to do. He'd agreed to participate in the project, and walking away would mean breaking clearance protocols, violating oaths, and potentially facing consequences he couldn't predict. So he continued, day after day, session after session, logging data, recording impressions, and carrying the weight of secrets that no one else would ever know. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Sherman's doubts were hardening into resolve. He didn't know what he would do with the knowledge he'd accumulated, but he knew he couldn't carry it forever. And he began to wonder if there would come a time when the cost of silence exceeded the cost of speaking. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. It happened during a routine session. Sherman had logged dozens of transmissions by that point, perhaps hundreds. The work had settled into a predictable rhythm, and he'd learned to navigate the interface with a kind of practiced detachment. But on this particular day, something went wrong. The session began normally. Sherman sat at the terminal, cleared his mind, and opened himself to the familiar process of receiving impressions. Bones had been transmitting regularly, and Sherman expected another stream of logistical data, coordinates, times, the usual. But what arrived was different. The impressions came with an intensity that Sherman had never experienced before. They weren't just signals. They felt invasive, overwhelming, as though something was pushing into his awareness with far more force than usual. Sherman tried to maintain his composure, to process the information as he'd been trained to do, but the impressions kept coming, faster and more chaotic than he could handle. Images, emotions, concepts, all flooding into his consciousness at once, and he felt disoriented, dizzy. The room around him seemed to recede, and for a moment he wasn't sure where he was. The boundary between himself and the transmission dissolved, and he couldn't tell whether the thoughts in his mind were his own or something being imposed from outside. Sherman tried to pull back to close the connection, but he didn't know how. The interface wasn't a machine he could turn off. It was his own consciousness, and once the channel was open, he had no control over what came through. The impressions continued. They carried a sense of urgency, of desperation almost, as though the entity on the other end was trying to convey something critical and couldn't wait for Sherman to process it slowly. But Sherman couldn't process it at all. The information was too dense, too fast, too alien. It felt like being submerged in something vast and incomprehensible, and he was drowning in it. He must have made a sound, a gasp or a cry, because one of the supervisors entered the room. Sherman was vaguely aware of a voice asking if he was all right, but he couldn't respond. He was locked in the transmission, overwhelmed by the flood of impressions that wouldn't stop. Eventually the session ended. The impressions faded, receding back into the void from which they'd come, and Sherman was left sitting at the terminal, trembling, drenched in sweat. The supervisor helped him out of the chair and escorted him to a nearby room where he could rest. Sherman sat there for a long time, trying to calm his breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He felt violated. That was the only word for it. The transmission hadn't been communication. It had been an invasion. Something had forced its way into his consciousness without regard for his ability to handle it, and the experience had left him shaken in ways that went beyond fear. When the supervisor returned, Sherman tried to explain what he'd experienced, but the words came out fragmented, incoherent. He couldn't articulate the sensation of being overwhelmed, of losing control over his own mind, of feeling like he was no longer the one in charge of his own thoughts. The supervisor listened, made notes, and told Sherman to take the rest of the day off. There would be a review of the session logs, and they would determine whether any adjustments needed to be made to the interface protocols. But Sherman knew that no protocol adjustment would fix what had happened. The problem wasn't technical, it was existential. He went home that day and tried to act normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had been damaged. The experience had left a mark, and he didn't know if it would fade or if it was permanent. His wife asked if he was okay. He told her he was just tired, that work had been stressful. But the lie felt hollow. He wasn't just tired. He was fractured. Sherman didn't return to the interface immediately. He was given a few days to recover, and during that time he tried to process what had happened. He replayed the session in his mind, searching for some explanation, some way to make sense of the overwhelming flood of impressions. But there was no clarity, just the memory of being submerged in something too vast to comprehend, and the lingering fear that it could happen again. When he finally returned to the project, Sherman was different. The detachment he'd cultivated was gone, replaced by a deep, visceral wariness. He no longer trusted the interface. He no longer trusted the entities he was communicating with. And he no longer trusted that the project was safe. The supervisors noticed the change, but didn't comment on it. They simply instructed him to resume his sessions, to continue logging the transmissions to maintain the connection. Sherman obeyed, but inside he was beginning to break. The sessions became a source of dread. Every time he sat at the terminal, he wondered if the overwhelming flood would return, if he would lose control again, if the communication would push him beyond the point of recovery. And he began to ask himself a question he'd been avoiding for months. What if the entities didn't care about his well-being? What if they were using him, not as a partner in communication, but as a tool? What if his consciousness was just a convenient channel, and when it broke they would simply find another? The question haunted him, and it marked the beginning of the end of his involvement in Project Preserve Destiny. Because Sherman realized, sitting in that sterile room, that he couldn't continue. Not like this. Not at the cost of his sanity, his sense of self, his ability to distinguish between what was his and what was being imposed on him from outside. He didn't quit immediately. The clearance protocols, the military structure, the weight of the oaths he'd taken, all of it kept him locked in place for a while longer. But the decision had been made. Sherman would find a way out. And when he did, he would take the story with him. Chapter 9. Disclosure and Doubt. Dan Sherman left the Air Force in the late 1990s. The details of his departure aren't entirely clear, but by his own account he'd reached a point where continuing with Project Preserve Destiny was no longer tenable. The work had taken a toll, mentally, emotionally, and perhaps in ways that went deeper than either category could capture. But leaving the project didn't free him from it. The experiences stayed with him. The memories of sitting at the interface, the impressions that had flooded his awareness, the sense that he'd been part of something vast and troubling, all of it lingered. And Sherman made a decision that would define the rest of his public life. He decided to tell the story. In 1998, Sherman published a book titled Above Black, Project Preserve Destiny, Insider Account of Alien Contact and Government Cover-Up. It was self-published, which meant it didn't have the backing or scrutiny of a major publisher, but it also meant that Sherman had full control over what he revealed. The book was detailed. It described his recruitment into Project Preserve Destiny, the training he received in intuitive communication, his interactions with the entities he called Spock and Bones, and the gradual realization that he was logging abduction data rather than participating in benign research. Sherman wrote in a straightforward style. There was no sensationalism, no attempt to embellish the story for dramatic effect. He presented the events as he remembered them, acknowledging the strangeness of what he was claiming while maintaining that it had happened. The reaction was mixed. Within the UFO research community, Sherman's testimony generated significant interest. Here was someone who claimed to have worked inside a classified government program involving extraterrestrial communication. He wasn't a distant whistleblower or an anonymous source. He had a name, a military background, and a detailed account that could be examined and discussed. Some researchers found Sherman's story compelling. The internal consistency was strong. The details about military procedures, clearance protocols, and the structure of classified programs aligned with what was known about how such operations functioned. And Sherman's demeanor, calm, measured, seemingly sincere, lent credibility to the account. But others were skeptical. The story was extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Sherman didn't have physical proof. He couldn't provide documentation, recordings, or corroboration from other participants in the project. All he had was his testimony, and testimony, no matter how detailed, is vulnerable to doubt. Critics pointed out that Sherman's account couldn't be verified. There was no way to confirm that Project Preserve Destiny existed. No documents had been declassified, no other whistleblowers had come forward, and the entities Sherman claimed to have communicated with couldn't be interviewed or examined. Some suggested that Sherman had misinterpreted his experiences, that the intuitive communication he described was actually a form of self-deception or psychological projection. Others speculated that he might have been part of a psychological experiment designed to test how military personnel respond to disinformation or altered states of consciousness. And then there were those who simply dismissed the account as fabrication, either deliberate for attention or profit, or unconscious, the result of genuine belief in something that hadn't actually occurred. Sherman addressed these criticisms as best he could. He acknowledged that he had no physical evidence. He understood that his story was difficult to believe, but he maintained consistently that the events had happened as he described them. He gave interviews. He spoke at conferences. He engaged with researchers, skeptics, and curious individuals who wanted to know more. But he never escalated his claims. He didn't add new details to make the story more dramatic. He simply repeated what he'd written in the book, answering questions when he could, and admitting uncertainty when he couldn't. The book didn't make Sherman famous. It didn't trigger congressional hearings or government investigations. It circulated within a relatively small community of people interested in UFOs, classified programs, and whistleblower testimony, but it persisted. Copies of Above Black continued to circulate both in print and digitally. Sherman's story became part of the broader tapestry of accounts involving government contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, not conclusive but present, a data point in a much larger and more ambiguous picture. Over time, Sherman's public presence diminished. He gave fewer interviews, appeared at fewer conferences, and gradually withdrew from the spotlight. It was unclear whether this was by choice or circumstance, but the effect was the same. The story remained, but the storyteller faded. And that left those who encountered Sherman's testimony with a question. What do you do with a story like this? You can't prove it. You can't disprove it. You can analyze it, contextualize it, compare it to other accounts, and try to assess its credibility. But in the end, you're left with the same fundamental uncertainty. Either Dan Sherman is telling the truth or he isn't. Either Project Preserve Destiny existed or it didn't. Either the communication he described was real or it was something else entirely. And the silence from the institutions that would know, the NSA, the Air Force, the intelligence community, offers no answers. Just the blank wall of classification, secrecy, and official denial. Sherman's story sits in that ambiguous space, not confirmed, not refuted, just present, waiting for someone to decide what to believe. Chapter 10. Skeptics and Sympathizers. The response to Dan Sherman's testimony divided along predictable lines, but the division wasn't as simple as believers versus skeptics. There was a spectrum of reaction, and the nuances within that spectrum are worth examining. On one end were those who accepted Sherman's account at face value. These were primarily individuals within the UFO research community who had long believed that the US government maintained classified programs involving extraterrestrial contact. For them, Sherman's story wasn't shocking, it was confirmation. They pointed to the consistency of his narrative, the details about military procedure, the way he described the clearance process, the structure of the classified facility. All of it aligned with what insiders would know. Sherman hadn't made obvious mistakes, hadn't contradicted himself in significant ways, and hadn't embellished the story over time. They also noted the emotional restraint in his testimony. Sherman didn't present himself as a hero or a martyr. He described his role in the project with a kind of weary resignation, acknowledging his complicity in logging abduction data while expressing discomfort with what he'd been part of. That nuance felt authentic to many listeners. But acceptance of Sherman's story didn't mean uncritical belief. Even within the community of sympathizers, there were questions. Why hadn't other participants come forward? If Project Preserve Destiny existed, there must have been others involved. Technicians, supervisors, additional communicators. Where were they? Sherman's answer was that the project was compartmentalized, that participants were kept isolated from one another, and that the clearance protocols ensured silence even after people left the program. It was a reasonable explanation, but it also meant that verification remained elusive. On the other end of the spectrum were the skeptics. They approached Sherman's testimony with the same rigor they applied to any extraordinary claim, and they found it lacking. The primary issue was evidence. Sherman had none. No documents, no recordings, no physical artifacts from his time in the project. Just his memory and his account. And while memory can be compelling, it's also notoriously unreliable. Skeptics pointed out that human memory is reconstructive. We don't recall events like playing back a recording. We reconstruct them each time we remember, and in that reconstruction, details can shift, be added, or be influenced by later information. Sherman's account, delivered years after the events, could have been shaped by exposure to UFO literature, cultural narratives about alien contact, or his own psychological processing of ambiguous experiences. There was also the question of motive. Why would Sherman fabricate such a story? The skeptics offered a few possibilities. Attention, a desire to be part of something significant, financial gain from book sales, or more generously, genuine belief in experiences that had a more mundane explanation. Some skeptics suggested that Sherman might have been part of a psychological experiment. Military and intelligence agencies have a documented history of conducting research on altered states of consciousness, sensory deprivation, and the effects of disinformation. It's possible that Sherman was subjected to a program designed to make participants believe they were communicating with extraterrestrials when, in fact, they were simply experiencing the effects of suggestion, isolation, or experimental techniques. This explanation had the advantage of accounting for Sherman's sincerity without requiring the existence of actual alien contact. He could have genuinely believed he was part of Project Preserve Destiny, while the reality was something more prosaic and more disturbing, a study of how easily human perception and belief can be manipulated. But this explanation also had weaknesses. If the project was purely psychological, why the elaborate setup? Why train Sherman in signals intelligence, recruit him into a classified program, and create the entire framework of intuitive communication? And why let him leave and publish a book about it? The questions multiplied, but the answers didn't. Between the extremes of acceptance and rejection, there was a middle ground. Researchers who approached Sherman's testimony with cautious curiosity. They didn't commit to believing the account, but they didn't dismiss it outright either. These individuals noted that Sherman's story shared themes with other whistleblower accounts. References to genetic modification, prenatal programs, intuitive communication, and abduction monitoring appeared in multiple testimonies from people who claimed to have worked in classified programs. The consistency across accounts was striking. Even if it didn't constitute proof, it suggested either a shared reality, a shared delusion, or a shared source of disinformation. Determining which of those three options was correct required more information than was available. So the middle ground researchers catalogued Sherman's testimony, compared it to others, and waited for additional data points that might clarify the picture. One particularly interesting aspect of Sherman's story was the entities themselves, Spock and Bones. The names were clearly Sherman's inventions, nicknames he'd given to presences that didn't identify themselves linguistically. But the descriptions of their communication styles, one cold and analytical, the other warmer and more engaged, matched patterns reported by individuals who claimed to have had contact with non-human intelligences. Was that evidence of something real, or evidence that people who believe in alien contact tend to describe similar archetypes? The question remained open. There was also the issue of intuitive communication itself. Was it possible? Parapsychology research had investigated concepts like telepathy and remote viewing for decades, with mixed and often controversial results. Some studies suggested that under controlled conditions, people could access information through means that didn't correspond to normal sensory channels. Other studies failed to replicate those findings. If intuitive communication were real, it would represent a significant anomaly in our understanding of consciousness and cognition. But anomalies require robust evidence, and Sherman's testimony, however detailed, didn't provide that. So the debate continued. Skeptics remained skeptical, sympathizers remained sympathetic, and the vast majority of people never heard Sherman's story at all. But for those who did encounter it, the testimony left an impression. Not because it was conclusive, but because it was specific. Sherman didn't claim vague spiritual contact or abstract visions. He described a program, a facility, a process, and entities with distinct characteristics. That specificity made the story harder to dismiss, but it also made it harder to accept. Because if Sherman was telling the truth, it meant that something profound and disturbing had been happening in classified spaces involving non-human intelligences, genetic manipulation, and the systematic monitoring of human abductions, and if that were true, the implications stretched far beyond one man's testimony. Chapter 11. The deeper implications. Let's step back for a moment and consider what it would mean if even a fragment of Dan Sherman's story were true. Not the entire narrative, not every detail, but just the core claim that a classified program existed to facilitate communication between human operatives and non-human intelligences. If that were real, the implications would ripple outward in ways that are difficult to fully grasp. First, it would mean that contact has already occurred, not as a future possibility or a distant hope, but as an established reality, managed and classified by government institutions. The question wouldn't be whether we're alone in the universe, it would be how long we've known we aren't, and what's been done with that knowledge. Second, it would suggest that the contact is ongoing. Sherman's work in the 1990s, if real, was part of a larger operation. Projects like Preserve Destiny don't spring into existence overnight. They require infrastructure, precedent, and continuity, which means that either the program still exists in some form, or it was replaced by something else. Third, it would imply that the relationship between humanity and these non-human intelligences is complex, structured, and perhaps not entirely voluntary. Sherman's description of logging abduction data suggests that the entities he communicated with were involved in activities that affected human lives directly. And the fact that the government was monitoring those activities, rather than preventing them, raises uncomfortable questions about consent, cooperation, and control. Who decides what happens in that relationship? Are the entities operating independently, with the government simply observing? Or is there coordination, agreement, or even collaboration? Sherman's testimony doesn't answer those questions, but it suggests that the answers exist somewhere in classified files that the public will never see. There's also the question of intuitive communication itself. If such a thing is possible, it represents a fundamental shift in how we understand consciousness. It suggests that minds can interface directly, without language, without physical proximity, and without the sensory channels we typically rely on. That has implications beyond alien contact. If human consciousness can be trained or modified to receive information intuitively, what else might be possible? Could intuitive communication be used for other purposes? Intelligence gathering, psychological influence, or even control? The prenatal program Sherman described adds another layer. If his mother was unknowingly part of an effort to create individuals capable of interfacing with non-human intelligences, it means that genetic or neurological modification of human beings has been conducted covertly, without informed consent for decades. That alone would be a profound ethical violation, but it would also suggest that the capacity for intuitive communication isn't naturally present in most people. It has to be engineered. Which raises the question, why? What purpose does it serve to create a small population of humans capable of this kind of communication? Is it purely for intelligence gathering, as Sherman's role suggests? Or is there a longer-term goal, something tied to the broader relationship between humanity and these non-human entities? Sherman's testimony hints at the latter. The impressions he received from bones suggested that humanity has been prepared for contact over millennia, that the process has been gradual, deliberate, and guided by intelligences that operate on timescales far longer than human institutions. If that's true, it means that what we think of as human history, our cultures, our beliefs, our technological development, may have been influenced subtly or overtly by forces we don't recognize. It's a staggering idea, and it's one that can't be proven or disproven based on Sherman's testimony alone. But the idea is there, embedded in the narrative, and it lingers. There's also the question of why this information would be classified. If contact has occurred, if communication is ongoing, why not disclose it? The standard answer is that public knowledge of alien contact would cause panic, destabilization, or a collapse of social structures. People wouldn't know how to process the information, and the result would be chaos. But that explanation assumes that the public is fragile, incapable of adapting to new realities. And while there would certainly be disruption, it's not clear that secrecy serves the public interest better than transparency. An alternative explanation is that the secrecy isn't about protecting the public. It's about protecting the institutions that manage the contact. If the relationship with non-human intelligence involves cooperation, agreements, or activities that the public would find objectionable, then disclosure becomes a threat not to social stability, but to the legitimacy of those institutions. Sherman's testimony, if accurate, suggests that the government has been complicit in monitoring abductions, events that involve the non-consensual removal of human beings from their environments. If that were publicly known, it would raise profound questions about government priorities, ethics, and accountability. Secrecy in that context isn't just about managing information. It's about maintaining control over a narrative that, if fully revealed, might undermine the authority of the institutions involved. These are speculative implications. They rest on the assumption that Sherman's account is true, and that assumption remains unverified. But the exercise of thinking through the implications is valuable, regardless of whether the underlying story is real. Because even if Sherman's testimony is false, the questions it raises are real. What would it mean if contact had occurred? How would we know? Who would control that information? And what would we do with it if we ever gained access? Those questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking. Because whether or not Project Preserve Destiny existed, the possibility of contact and the structures that would surround it is something humanity will eventually have to confront. Sherman's story, true or not, is a rehearsal for that confrontation, a thought experiment that forces us to consider how we would respond to a reality far stranger than anything we've collectively acknowledged, and in that sense the story has value, not as evidence but as exploration, a quiet, unsettling reminder that the boundaries of what we know are narrower than we often assume. Chapter 12. The Silence That Followed. After the publication of Above Black, Dan Sherman's presence in the public sphere gradually diminished. He gave interviews for a few years, appeared at conferences, and engaged with people who wanted to know more about his experiences. But eventually the invitations became less frequent, the interest waned, and Sherman withdrew from the spotlight. It's unclear whether this was by choice or circumstance. Sherman never issued a public statement explaining his departure from the UFO research community. He simply stopped appearing. The story remained, but the storyteller faded into the background. This pattern isn't unusual among whistleblowers, particularly those whose claims can't be verified. Without new information, without corroboration, the story reaches a plateau. It's been told, it's been heard, and there's nothing left to add. Sherman's testimony became a reference point cited by some researchers, ignored by others, and largely unknown to the general public. It exists in that strange space occupied by many UFO-related accounts, neither proven nor debunked, just present, waiting for context that may never arrive. The lack of follow-up is itself significant. If Project Preserve Destiny were real, one might expect additional whistleblowers to emerge eventually. Classified programs don't remain secret forever. People retire, clearances expire, and institutional memory fades. Eventually someone talks. But no one else has come forward with testimony that directly corroborates Sherman's account. No other individuals have claimed to be intuitive communicators trained by the NSA. No documents have been leaked. No evidence has surfaced. That absence doesn't definitively prove the story is false. Classified programs are compartmentalized precisely to prevent the kind of corroboration that would make verification possible. Each participant knows only their own role, and the larger picture remains obscured. But the absence does make the story harder to sustain. Without additional data points, Sherman's testimony remains an isolated account, compelling to some, dismissible to others, and ultimately unresolvable. The entities Sherman described, Spock, Bones, and the others, remain silent as well. If they exist, they haven't communicated with anyone else publicly, or at least not in any way that's been documented. The transmissions Sherman logged, if they were real, have left no trace beyond his memory and the pages of his book. And the abductions he claimed to monitor continue to be reported, though without any clear connection to government programs or classified communication channels. The phenomenon persists, but the framework Sherman described for understanding it hasn't gained traction. So the story sits, archived in the collective memory of a subculture, occasionally referenced, rarely examined in depth. It's become one of many accounts that populate the ambiguous landscape of UFO research, intriguing, frustrating, and ultimately inconclusive. But there's something haunting about the silence that followed Sherman's disclosure. Not the silence of refutation or debunking, but the silence of abandonment. The story was told, and then it was left behind. No follow-up, no investigation, no resolution. It's the kind of silence that suggests either disinterest or deliberate neglect. Either the institutions that would know the truth don't consider Sherman's testimony worth addressing, or they've chosen not to engage with it at all. And that silence, in its own way, is an answer. Not a definitive one, but a response nonetheless. It says that whatever Sherman experienced, whatever he believed he was part of, it doesn't matter enough to warrant acknowledgement. Or perhaps it matters too much, because silence can be a strategy. It can be a way of managing information without confirming or denying it. By refusing to engage with Sherman's testimony, the institutions he implicated avoid the risk of giving it credibility. They let it exist in the margins, where it can be dismissed by those who choose to dismiss it and believed by those who choose to believe. The ambiguity serves a purpose. It keeps the story contained, and it ensures that questions about Project Preserve Destiny, about intuitive communication, about the relationship between government agencies and non-human intelligences remain speculative rather than factual. Sherman himself is part of that silence now. He's no longer a public figure, no longer an active voice in the discussion. The story he told is all that remains, and even that is fading from view as new accounts, new whistleblowers, and new theories emerge to replace it. But the story doesn't entirely disappear. It lingers, like static on an empty channel. A faint signal that some people still pick up, still wonder about, still turn over in their minds late at night, when the familiar world feels a little less certain. There's a melancholy to that persistence. Sherman claimed to be the bridge between human intelligence and something beyond it. He described a role that, if real, would have made him one of the most significant figures in human history, a translator between worlds, a conduit for first contact. But instead of recognition, he received silence. Instead of investigation, he received indifference. And instead of resolution, he received only the slow erosion of time and memory. Perhaps that's the true cost of secrecy. Not just the suppression of information, but the isolation of those who carry it. Sherman, if his account is true, was left alone with knowledge that no one could verify and that few would believe. And when he tried to share it, the response wasn't persecution or punishment. It was simply nothing. A blank wall, a closed door, a conversation that ended before it began. And so the story fades, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with the slow, steady loss of attention that eventually claims all things that can't be proven. But every so often someone discovers Sherman's testimony. They read Above Black. They listen to an old interview. They encounter the story secondhand through a friend or a website. And for a moment they wonder. They wonder if it's true. They wonder what it would mean if it were. And they wonder why, if the story is false, it feels so carefully constructed, so detailed, so specific. The wondering doesn't resolve anything, but it keeps the story alive in a quiet, persistent way. A signal that hasn't quite faded, a presence that hasn't entirely left. And maybe that's enough. Not for proof, not for closure, but for something else. A reminder that the edges of human knowledge are still unmapped. That there are spaces where strange claims can't be disproven, where silence is louder than denial, and where the absence of answers becomes its own kind of testimony. If Sergeant Dan Sherman ever did speak to something beyond this world, then maybe the strangest part of his story isn't what he heard, but the silence that answered back.